Thank you very much for making time to join us today. My name is Chelsea Reinhardt. I'm the Standards Director for ASI, and welcome to our second webinar on the launch of the standards revision. So we had a good audience this morning who joined us, and here we are today catering to different time zones. So today you'll hear from myself, Chelsea Reinhardt, and you'll also hear from my colleague, Chris Bayliss, who's our Director of Climate and Decarbonization. We will start by giving you a bit of an overview on ASI and the standards revision process, why we're revising the standards, how we're going to revise, and what opportunities we have for stakeholders and ASI members such as yourselves to get involved. And then Chris will also take you through what we're calling an early preview of what some of those potential changes, both in structure and in content, might look like, just to give you a little bit of a sense of what some of the ambition of that revision will look like and where there may be opportunities for you to inform and participate in that work. So first, just a bit of an overview. If you're on the webinar already, you're probably familiar with ASI, but just a reminder of who we are and what we're working to do. We are a global multi-stakeholder nonprofit standard setting and certification organization. We are a membership organization, so we really work to support the interests of our members across the sector. And really an important distinction here is that ASI was set up originally and continues to work today to drive responsible sourcing and production of aluminium across the value chain. So we're really aiming to engage all the way from the bauxite mine through the value chain down to manufacturing companies to support improvement around sustainability practices and outcomes. And that's quite important because it's a distinct way of engaging. It's a distinct theory of change. We're not trying to recognize the top 10% of responsible or sustainable companies that work in aluminium and support those companies to gain more market share. Instead, we really are trying to work with entities at all levels of their sustainability journey to collectively kind of lift their progress and support some of these initiatives, which really do require companies to be working across the supply chain together. We have a multi-stakeholder governance structure, which is quite unique in the sector. So we have our board, which is composed both of industry members, but also civil society members. We have a 26-person strong standards committee, and that's the group that's overseeing our technical standards development work, including this revision. And that is elected out of our membership and includes representatives from different parts of industry across the supply chain, but also from civil society. And also actually on the standards committee, we have representatives from our Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum, or IPAF. And that is a unique organization that ASI convenes that brings together participants and leaders from Indigenous communities around the world to make sure that their views and their priorities are represented not only in ASI's work, but actually in the setting of expectations in those standards. And then we also have, of course, our membership who are really supporting priorities and influencing the areas of work for ASI as an organization, and that will be reflected as well in the standard setting process. So ASI actually has a birthday coming up this year. It will be the 10th anniversary of the organization in 2025. And you can see from the graph on the left that over the last decade, we've had really significant growth in membership from the time we were first founded. So we now have more than 350 members across all different categories of membership, with the greatest categories being production and transformation, which is really sort of upstream to midstream aluminium companies. But we also have a good share of members who are our downstream manufacturing companies, industrial users, and downstream supporters. And also in our membership, we have civil society, industry associations, and others. We have on the right, this is data from last year, and it's showing that by volume, actually, based on last year's data, more than 30% of the bauxite being produced in bauxite mines actually globally was being produced by entities that were certified against the ASI performance standard. So that's almost a third of global production by volume. And by the time you get down to the rolling mill in the supply chain, actually our share of that market goes up to 45% of the volume is being manufactured in facilities that are under the ASI standard. And that's quite a significant footprint in the sector. And it means that if we're able to leverage that presence to better drive kind of positive change or impact. So even small adjustments in the ASI standards around, for example, working conditions or labor rights or circularity expectations or emissions can actually have a magnified impact in the sector and can create actually some pretty large changes across that certification base. And just to show a bit of our global footprint, so although we have the strongest base of certifications in Europe, we also have a significant presence in North America and Asia, and a number of certifications across other continents. This is a great opportunity because it really means we are working as a kind of global standard, especially for companies with sites or locations in multiple countries, one standard to meet. But of course, as we'll find out in the next year and a half or 2 years, it does create challenges in drafting a standard that is contextually works in lots of different operating contexts and works with different regulations and different kind of local contextual factors. So this is both a strength of the ASI system, but also sometimes a challenge we'll need to navigate. Here we just have a very quick look at how the standard setting work fits into ASI's overall strategy and theory of change. So you can see here in the medium-term outcomes that this is really the next evolution of ASI standards to meet evolving stakeholder needs. That's planned for 2025 into 2027. And really that is one of the mechanisms that we're using to try and support progress on these long-term goals or impact areas. And the 4 main areas of work that ASI is focusing on in the aluminium sector are climate, circularity, nature, and social value. So it's not to say that there aren't other areas that are important, but these are really the 4 kind of primary areas of outcomes that we're looking to drive positive impacts in. So what are the standards? What are we talking about? What's the scope of the revision? So many of you are probably familiar with our performance standard. That's the core environmental, social, and governance standard. And unique for ASI's system is that from the very beginning, that performance standard we've expected to be applied across the aluminium value chain. So in many voluntary standard systems or certification programs, there is a production standard, which is applicable really upstream at the point of production, the farm or the mine. And then most of that supply chain might be covered by a chain of custody standard, possibly with a few additional requirements. But in ASI's approach, it's really an expectation that each link in that value chain adheres to the same high levels of expectations around environmental, social, and governance components. Next, we have the chain of custody standard. So this is an optional standard in the ASI system. It is currently using a group mass balance model to track the volumes of equivalent ASI certified or COC material as it moves through the value chain. And that standard is optional, but it is required for any entity that either wants to make a business-to-business or business-to-consumer claim about selling or buying COC material, or that wants to use the ASI logo on product or to set any sort of volume sourcing claims. But these 2 standards are not working alone. They're actually accompanied by a suite of other technical documents and materials. And that includes our claims guide that sets out requirements on how to make claims in a credible way and how to verify those claims. We also have quite a lot of guidance around the chain of custody and the performance standard. Gives best practices, gives examples, gives implementation guidance as well to support the requirements. And quite critically, we have an assurance manual, which includes the whole auditing assessment side of the program on how actually the implementation of those standards will be verified in practice. And all of that as well will be considered in the scope of the standard revision. So I'm sure some of you on the call are thinking, gosh, another ASI standards revision, didn't you just revise your standards? And I think for many in ASI, it does feel that way because these projects are comprehensive and multi-stakeholder. They take a good deal of time to do well. And that means each revision project is running at least a year or 2 years at a minimum. So we are often in a cycle of revision, implementation, and then review again. The last revision of the standards was carried out back in 2020, 2022, with those versions of the standards which are now live, originally rolled out in 2022. We are a member of ISEAL, which is an organization for credible sustainability standards and systems. Effectively, they set requirements that ASI is in turn audited against around transparent multi-stakeholder development processes. And that requires a review of standards at least every 5 years. Now, that doesn't mean that a review necessarily leads to a revision. You might do a review and decide actually to postpone a full revision, or you might do a review and decide only to revise specific sections of the standards. In this case, we carried out a formal review of the performance standard and the chain of custody standard last year from September to November of 2024. And based on those findings, our standards committee and our board agreed to launch a full revision process. And really that decision was driven by changes in the context around ASI, so the developments of new legislation and regulations, especially around due diligence, around sustainability claims, around circularity and other areas. Also the maturity of our membership. So we've seen a lot of maturing in sort of the sustainability journey and expectations of many of ASI members, and a sort of raising the bar in terms of expectations in specific areas. And also we've had some quite a lot of feedback from members consulted during that review process about re-looking at some of those original assumptions, particularly around our chain of custody and our claims offerings, and trying to think about opportunities to make sure that we are looking at claims and chain of custody systems that might better reflect the needs of our membership. So on the back of that review work, our committee set out some very specific objectives for this upcoming revision. And these are also covered in more detail in the terms of reference for the revision, which is on our website at that link there. The first objective is to enable greater differentiation. So at the moment, we have a kind of one-size-fits-all approach in the performance standard. You either meet the criteria or you get a minor or major nonconformity, but really it's one set of criteria, one set of expectations. And increasingly, as our membership grows and matures, but also as we look to engage members in new areas, new geographies, new sections of the supply chain, we see a need for differentiation of performance. And even a company that's very strong in some sustainability areas maybe is not as strong in others. So looking at options for differentiation will also help us to define pathways for continuous improvement. And all the detail on how that would work in practice, and is it scored, and are there 2 levels, are there 3 levels, all of that still needs to be worked out and decided on. This is just an early stage aspiration. The second objective is to further strengthen credibility of the standards and also that related assurance and audit framework. So we will be looking much more closely on the auditability of requirements as they are developed, and building corresponding kind of conformance guidance that goes hand in hand with the development of the revised standard. Third is to really look at relevance and materiality. So trying to take a bit more of a flexible approach to focus more effort on the issues that are most critical, either at different point in the value chain or based on different location or activity, as opposed to asking all entities to cover kind of the full breadth of ESG areas. Fourth is to strengthen the focus on priorities for Indigenous peoples and other traditional communities, and that's really coming through our IPAP engagement. One area that's already been flagged there as particular areas of interest, well, actually a couple of areas, Chris will talk more later on. One is really around the application of free, prior, and informed consent, making sure that that is carried out thoroughly and in a credible way. And the second actually is looking at mine closure and rehabilitation expectations and making sure that actually the needs of local communities in the long term are really being considered in that process. The fifth objective is about enhancing value to ASI members through certification, and that might look at, for example, positioning the standard to better help members meet their due diligence obligations, or exploring some of those new categories of claims that might better reflect the needs of downstream members in particular. Sixth is to further improve alignment with other standards. So always we hear from members that harmonization and benchmarking with other standards is really important. It's a crowded landscape, and the last thing we want is more duplication of effort, more auditing burden. So that will continue to be a priority for us. And lastly, but not least, is to renew the focus on impact. So we want a standard where meeting the requirements is not only ticking the boxes for compliance, but actually really linked to driving positive impacts. And you will see in some of the early structural diagrams that Chris is going to share later on, that actually from the beginning, we have defined what are some of the outcome areas that we want to see impacts in related to each of these pillars or topic areas in the new standard. And we also are looking to include more sort of outcome-based criteria within that draft standard this time around. So in terms of timelines, we are here at the beginning of 2025. Well, not so much the beginning anymore, coming into end of March. We have started a lot of the foundational work for this revision last year based on the learnings from the review and our knowledge about what's working and not working in the current standard. 2025 is really going to be a development year where we're doing a lot of drafting, but we also will be doing a lot of what we're calling informal consultation hand in hand with that drafting. So that's getting feedback from members and certified entities, from technical experts, also from auditors to make sure that that initial draft reflects a lot of the needs and practicalities actually of our membership base. If all goes to plan, we'll be looking at a first public consultation period sometime probably in the first quarter of 2026. And then we will be consolidating, analyzing the feedback, and have a second public consultation towards the third quarter of 2026 with an eye to finalizing that standard in early 2027. So although these are always long projects and there has to be lots of opportunity for engagement and consultation, we've also learned that if these projects get too long, it's hard to keep the momentum and the engagement of those critical stakeholders. So that timeline may shift, but that's the indicative framework that we're hoping to work toward. And then, of course, there would be a transition phase after that, where entities on the current standards would have plenty of time to transition and to prepare for a new standard coming into effect. In terms of development process, so just showing a little bit about how we're working with different sources of input. We have our standards committee, as already explained, who's overseeing this work. We have our secretariat team, ASI team, who's going to do a lot of the work on consolidating input, drafting, taking feedback from different sources, and also really putting that into sort of consistent structure and voice. We have a lot of work with other standards and key partners to make sure we are bringing that alignment and harmonization into the process and also not reinventing the wheel when it doesn't need to be. And we have a formal process to engage technical experts, so experts in labor rights, for example, or occupational health and safety, or biodiversity, to make sure that we actually have time for them to do detailed reviews of the draft standards and provide their expertise in. And critically, we will be forming 6 new member working groups across different thematic areas. So those actually are open to ASI, to non-members as well. And they will be capped, and we'll talk more about those later. But those are really designed to be a sounding board to make sure that there's lots of feedback opportunities to see how things are developing, to put options out to those working groups and have them say, oh, yes, this works for me, or oh, no, have you thought about this, or I have a concern over here, or here's a gap that we'd like to see addressed. And then importantly, we've got representatives from our rights holder group, the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum, that are sitting on the standards committee, but also represented in working groups and as technical experts. So sometimes when we talk to members about the ASI standards, there's the impression that actually these are standards that we're just writing ourselves at ASI, that we kind of go away and draft the requirements and then come back and share them with members for consultation. And really, that's not the case. Really, these are standards that are driven by the needs and the expectations of our membership, and also that are seeking to balance the sometimes conflicting views between businesses and civil society and rights holders that work in our sector. So one of the kind of fundamental dynamics or tensions that we will be working with for the next 1.5 to 2 years is this kind of pressure on where are we setting the bar? How ambitious should we be with the standards? If we set that bar too high and we're too ambitious with our expectation, the standard is rigorous and credible. It's reviewed very well by ratings organizations and civil society, but it may be inaccessible for many companies to implement. And that means that we actually don't have the opportunity to engage those companies or to drive the change at sector level. If we set the bar too low, then we're very accessible, we have lots of uptake, but we're considered less credible and actually have less opportunity to drive positive impact. So all of those many working group conversations, technical expert inputs, focus groups, webinars, public consultation, pressure discussions are really going to be about having a set of conversations and finding the compromises to think about where those requirements are best set. And the differentiation that I mentioned earlier, that's one of the objectives for this revision, will give us a bit more flexibility to be able potentially to set a couple of different bars in different areas to reflect different levels of performance or different maturity levels of company. And this is why really your input as a member or as a technical expert or a civil society member is really important for us in this revision process. We simply cannot do it alone. So how to get involved? We have a new dedicated page on our website. If you go up to the standards section on the ASI website, it's called the Revision Hub. As a timeline, it's interactive. You can click on different sections to find out what's coming up, to register for webinars or for working groups. And then you can also sign up to stay updated for kind of regular updates on the standards revision process. We'll have a monthly kind of summary of what's going on and where we're at and any kind of key developments that will go out to that mailing list. And for the working group, so we have disbanded previously running working groups, some of which were active, some of which were dormant, and we are going to be setting up a new cohort of 6 working groups. Applications are open at the moment. It's a very short application form, so don't let that put you off. They are in these 6 areas here: climate change, circularity, nature, community rights and participation, labor rights and health and safety, and chain of custody and claims. And applications are open until end of March. We will be capping those working groups to keep them small enough so that every participant has a chance to really participate and give input. At the moment, we have a steady flow of applications, but we're looking like we do have some capacity. So please do apply or ask your colleagues to apply if they're interested. And now I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who's going to take you through some of the very early thinking on what might change or the types of changes that you might see in the revised standards, both in terms of structure and also some of the key content areas. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Chelsea. And just a quick reminder of the performance standard structure. Currently, this is how it's organized, version 3 performance standard, under the 3 pillars of governance, environment, and social, with discrete principles that are issue specific, if you will. And that's really a structure that has been inherited from earlier versions of the standard, version 1 and version 2, and they really reflect key risks identified in that early period, some of which have been added to, but most of which are still relevant as we go into version 4. But what we have found is that as these principles and the underlying criteria have evolved over different versions, what they've done is sometimes you get duplication and redundancy, where overarching systems, management systems, let's say, for each of these thematic areas are being duplicated in criteria, maybe with slightly different expectations by different criteria. And so really this revision process offers us an opportunity not only to add in new issues or to address new issues and to set the bar higher, it also offers us the opportunity to restructure the standard, to remove some of that redundancy, to remove duplication. Next slide, please. And so the early thoughts on structure are that some of those cross-cutting issues and some of the management systems that entities will need to evidence that they have in place, they maybe sit above these thematic areas. They cut across and really it's a question of having the entity evidence those management systems once across all criteria. And so the early thoughts are that we'll move some of those cross-cutting themes and systems out of individual criteria, and they will have their own cross-cutting band. Included in that would be responsible sourcing and due diligence, which cuts across many of these different areas, and actually at the moment is also included in the chain of custody standard. So revision of the chain of custody standard would also see removal of that duplication and that redundancy. And then, as Chelsea mentioned, underneath those, we of course have these existing criteria or the existing themes and any that are new, and I'll talk about some of those in a moment, but grouped according to these 5 pillars, broadly aligned with our strategy and sustainability objectives. And also, as Chelsea mentioned before, within these different impact areas, topic focused, there would be specific risk assessment and mitigation systems, so those that aren't cross-cutting, and as well as the processes for entities to manage risk, we're also looking to include more detailed indicators of industrial performance, as Chelsea mentioned before as well, those different levels operating at the different theme within each of the different themes. Next slide, please. And here's an example of what that might look like for a theoretical criterion. As Chelsea mentioned, the question or the answer on how many levels and what is the threshold for those levels, that's to be determined. But the early thoughts are that you would have a basic level, a level 1 indicator that entities would be expected to meet across the standard and across the criteria in order to gain certification, but that there's opportunities within each of those themes for a pathway towards improved performance, level 2 and or level 3, which would be a reflection of better practice or best practice. Recognizing that there are many different geographies, lots of different supply chain activities, very different materiality of risk for entities within ASI's ecosystem. So the structure of this is going to be important to ensure that the levels are appropriate for all of those different environments. You'll note in here as well the reference to outcome-based indicators. That's not just a measure of the systems in place, but a measure of the outcome that the application of those systems has led to, the positive environmental change or social impact as well. We do already have some outcome-based, or we have one at least outcome-based criterion in the existing standard related to greenhouse gases, and we might well see that expanded to some other key areas. But the thing to note right now is that we would not expect to see outcome-based indicators across the full suite of criteria. It would be for those where the outcome was measurable and where systems were mature enough to be able to assess the positive outcomes. Next slide, please. In addition to the structural change, what can we expect in terms of content change? As I mentioned before, some of those key risks that were identified way back in 2014 and prior to that, actually, the precursor to ASI and the version 1 of the standard, those risks and those themes, those areas, they are still there today. We had a question actually in the earlier webinar about the recycling value chain. And ASI's performance standard and chain of custody do cover recycling as well as the primary industry. But the early standards were written with that primary industry in mind. And so we can expect as the standard evolves that we're looking in a bit more detail at some of these other risk areas, for instance, human rights due diligence through the recycling and scrap stream. So those early risks, as I say, still kind of there. we're not seeing a huge addition to that, but what we can expect to see is tightening of the standard and maybe some lowered thresholds for performance as well, i.e. the bar is raised rather than lowered. One of those is due diligence, a reflection of some of the evolving regulation today. As I mentioned earlier, reducing that duplication and redundancy across the performance standard and the chain of custody standard. We'll see that in the new version, I would hope, but also expanded expectations around due diligence, including potentially environmental due diligence, reflecting some of the regulatory shifts that are occurring. So due diligence, there was a number of questions this morning actually around due diligence and the kind of guidance that's required for entities and auditors to evidence that they've done due diligence. And actually that's an opportunity for me to say, or to repeat, that this process is also about the revision of supporting information, guidance that allows entities to understand what it is they need to do. It's not just the criteria and the normative language. With respect to biodiversity, as it's currently in the standard, and ecosystem services, and a number of different nature-related topics, the plan at the moment is to frame all of those broadly under nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and importantly, opportunities, identifying the fact that entities and businesses don't just have an impact on the natural world across biodiversity, water, air, and land. They also depend on the services that are delivered by those ecosystems. The businesses themselves have nature-related dependencies. Without functioning ecosystems, you wouldn't have fully functioning businesses. And that includes not just natural dependencies, but also cultural dependencies as well within the landscape too. So this broad framing of nature related is going to be a critical area of focus. We have, as Chelsea mentioned, a nature working group, so go and sign up for that working group or any other that piques your interest. This is in alignment with the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosures and some of the other key frameworks that have recently evolved. So this again is about alignment with other standards or other frameworks as well. Third element, a more nuanced risk-based approach to labour-related impacts. This is really a response to what we're seeing coming through in audit reports against version 3, kind of a conflict or certainly a tension between regulatory systems and entity level practices as well. So expect to see some work on labour related impacts and risk-based approaches to those. That's really reflected in the fact that for the first time we have a working group that is specifically focused on labour and importantly on occupational health and safety. Next slide, please. Because OH&S, occupational health and safety, is another area of focus, and in particular, a strengthening of expectations around OH&S. And this is where we might well see, as Chelsea mentioned earlier on, specific risks being identified and there being some levels of performance expected against those. So OH&S and labour, really a big area for focus in the next 2 and a bit years. As Chelsea mentioned as well, free, prior and informed consent processes evolving. Already those FPIC processes are embedded in the current standard version 3. We can expect to see those evolve to be further developed and actually to be spread much more widely across thematic areas. So for instance, mine closure and rehabilitation is one area, the closure of bauxite residue disposal areas, and other stewardship of landscapes, cultural heritage, etc. is also in there too. In terms of new criteria, circularity, which is to some extent addressed in Principle 4 of the existing standard, to be really developed quite significantly around 2 areas, product level and production wastes. So I think that's, for those industrial folks, you could think of it one as kind of material stewardship, the other as product stewardship. So those ways of understanding how we operate our own operations, but also how systemically we reduce waste across the global economy. What mine tailings management, it's been asked for some time, really reflecting some work that's been going on outside of ASI. We do have a bauxite residue criterion in the current version, which is focused on those high volume stored materials, but nothing on specifically mine tailings. And so we can expect to see either new criteria or adapted criteria for mine tailings, probably referencing other standards or emerging standards, but very much focused on the aluminium industry specific risks. So where we identify there are gaps in those other standards, you might well expect to see ASI specific criteria included. Next slide, please. I note that someone's asked, will the slides be shared on? Yes. A recording of this will be uploaded to our YouTube channel in the coming days. So my favorite topic now, greenhouse gases. We currently have a number of criteria around greenhouse gas emissions. Actually, you can expect to see this evolve into the new version of the standard to really be about climate change writ large, and not just on emissions reduction, either the emissions within your facilities or embedded in the products that you bring into your system, but also to go beyond abatement and also to begin to look at removals, carbon dioxide removals, which are required under a 1.5 degree scenario, and also the potential for avoided emissions, understanding avoidance as one of the drivers for decarbonisation of the global economy. You'll note that we've had some challenges in meeting 1.5 degree slopes. That's why we published earlier this year a process to deal with that. Number of non-conformances across our entities, and I think you can probably expect to see an abatement curve at level 1 in the new version that is a bit higher than 1.5, probably a beyond 2 degree scenario, which is still Paris aligned. It's not 1.5 aligned, but that really is a reflection of some of these levels. You can see a pathway to improvement beyond 2, 1.5 degree, etc. A really important part in here is adaptation. So in addition to the mitigation of climate risks from the emissions embedded in aluminium products and processes, there's also a recognition that entities will need to build resilient facilities, resilient supply chains, resilient local communities to what will be a changing climate. And so understanding what those changes might be at the mine site level or the smelter level, understanding what those impacts might be to your supply chain, changing sea levels, infrastructure damage, etc. Those kind of elements and managing those risks, that's a new part of the standard. That's something that we'll be looking to build into version 4, not as offset for or avoiding discussion of abatement. Abatement curves will still form part of the standard, but to expand the climate-related criteria within the standard to reflect better the suite of risks that entities are facing. Join the Climate Change Working Group, or certainly put your name down in order to be part of those discussions. Next slide, please. We are changing our approach to chain of custody in the revision process, and we're not starting with the standard. We will be starting the discussion around chain of custody with what kind of claims do our entities want to make. We understand that product carbon footprint is one of those. Recycled content may be others. What kind of information do entities need in order to understand their supply chains? Understanding what kind of claims entities want to make, understanding the kind of data that's required to make those claims and to verify those claims, and then understanding the systems that enable that information to flow along the chain. Those are the questions we'll need to answer before we develop a system to enable that to happen. So you may well see a revised chain of custody standard out of this process, but it will be a reflection of this discussion of claims. First of all, is chain of custody the appropriate way to meet this demand for claims, or is it one of many? Supply chain risk mapping being, and other things being others. One thing to note, and it was a question that came in this morning, these product related claims and the enabling systems like chain of custody standard underneath that will continue to be voluntary under ASI system. So while performance standard would be certification may well be an expectation for industrial entities, the ability to make claims, product carbon footprinting, etc., would be a voluntary additional element offered by ASI. Lots of text on there. Go and have a look at it at a later date. Back to you, Chelsea.
Thanks, Chris. So that brings us to the end of our content to run through today. Thanks very much for your attention. Just a reminder back on applications for working groups, just to drive any interest here. We do have some questions that have come through the chat. So if you have a few minutes, we'll stick around and answer some of these. There were a couple questions related to the working groups, which we can take first. So there's a question about average time commitment. That's spelled out in the terms of reference, which is available at the moment on the bottom of the Revision Hub page. But we will also add it right to this working group sign-up page as well for you. And we're expecting that's about 6 to 8 meetings per group, online meetings from April 2025 until December 2025. That'll be the first phase of work. So 6 to 8 meetings, plus about an hour of work kind of in between each meeting to prepare. So roughly we've estimated around 20, maybe a bit more hours to be dedicated to that work. Yes, you can apply to more than one working group. If there are multiple applicants and we start to hit our kind of capacity, then we might have to limit the representatives from each organization. At the moment, though, I think we should be okay. Let's see, we had another question about how can Indigenous people get involved in audits? And that's one where already in our current approach and standard, we have a requirement, certainly that during audits, the audit team is consulting with and interviewing and in discussion with locally affected populations and communities, which would include Indigenous peoples. But also we have a fair amount of work through our Beyond Certification workstream, which is really about capacity strengthening and raising awareness of Indigenous peoples and communities about how to get involved and to participate in an audit and what that means for them and how to bring up issues and what issues they might be raising during that process. And lastly, I would say that certainly there's an opportunity through IPAF, but also through engagement in working groups and others for representatives of Indigenous peoples to become involved in the revision, and that will look at the assurance side as well as the standards side. All right, other questions? Chris, over to you. There's a question on plan to include monitoring on use of red mud. Do you want to take that one?
Sure thing. I'm going to change the question because that's always the prerogative of the person who answers it, right? Certainly the use or the use of red mud or bauxite residue is going to form part of that circularity discussion. So that waste reduction or that waste mitigation hierarchy piece. So you can expect to see, given that bauxite residue is by far the largest waste stream from the aluminium industry by orders of magnitude, that the circularity group will be looking at reuse. In terms of the monitoring on use of red mud, that's a great question about whether that forms the kind of metrics that would assess levels of performance. And we'll know that bauxite residue reuse opportunity is different in different parts of the world. So I expect that to be quite a interesting discussion by the working groups in the circularity to see, is there a threshold? Would we expect to see bars for that? Or would it be about the management of the residue per se? So if you're interested in that, I would suggest that the circularity working group is the one for you. But that actually is a great example of these kind of cross-cutting themes, because management of bauxite residue as a whole is really it's about large volume waste storage,
Mhm.
right? And so that really belongs in a different group. So we have to make sure that as we are developing criteria, that we're taking account of these kind of cross-cutting themes. Circularity, though, absolutely, reuse of red mud and all waste products, or certainly looking at all waste products, will form part of that.
All right, thanks, Chris. And we have a question about whether or not the proposed structure or content changes might affect our current OECD alignment. ASI at the moment has alignment with OECD around our CARA, conflict and high-risk affected areas, due diligence procedures. Certainly, it is our full intent to maintain that equivalence going forward. So we will be looking to do that, either bringing in kind of the current content and structure, and also high menu in discussions with LME to make sure that any adjustments proposed or that might be proposed through consultation are not going to affect our equivalence there. So certainly that is the intent.
And note that the questionnaire is from LME, so we'll be in touch.
I have noted that. We will follow up for sure. So there's one question that's come through. A few have been answered already. As ASI expands the topics and criteria to be checked, how does it plan to increase the capacity and availability of auditors who can audit these topics? That is a great question. The participant notes that there's already a limited number of ASI auditors in many places. Chris, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, look, I maybe talk about that challenge a little bit more. I think that's partly is a function of that structure of the standard right now, that everything is in there. And what we do find are the auditors going in either need to be equipped with a real breadth of knowledge and expertise, or some support for them to kind of engage with that standard, to really get down into the details. So part of the restructuring itself is going to help auditability. I think that's the first thing to say, is that we need to give auditors the tools that enable them to quickly and efficiently, in a robust way, evidence that entities have met the criteria without having to interrogate a lot. So I think there's a job to be done on the standards development side to make things more auditable, and that is going to make things more efficient and smooth things through the system. On the other side, though, you're right, in order to increase that capacity and availability of auditors, training is a critical element in that, to ensure that auditors have that capacity individually to engage with lots of these topics. In many places in the standard, it exists now and it will in the future, we ask for verified information, the auditor to check verified information. So we're not asking the auditor themselves to do the verification of greenhouse gas data, but rather to check evidence that verification has taken place by a third party. I think we'll see that more and more into the future as well. In terms of capacity of those auditors, the number of auditors available, that's a tricky issue, especially given the differential risks in different parts of the value chain. And there again, I think there's an opportunity as we talk about materiality. You know, if we know that bauxite mining in given geographies is a significant risk, that allows us to focus then on auditor capacity in those areas, rather than writ large saying, look, we need a whole heap of auditors in Europe. Actually, that may not be the case.
Thanks, Chris. And only to say that that assurance side of our standard system is also going to be reviewed in parallel with the standard. And that will look at things like auditor qualifications. It will look at things like minimum expectations for audit teams and personnel with different experiences, especially for higher risk assessments. So that's a great question that we do need to touch on. All right, we have another comment about does ASI provide grievance mechanisms? Yes, we do have a grievance mechanism. It's available on our website. That's an operational grievance mechanism for ASI, but it also does cover, and we do have some cases where it has been utilized by, for example, communities or rights holders related to ASI certifications. And there is more information available on that on our website. It also will be an enhanced set of requirements in the new version of the standards to come out related to certified entities and how their grievance mechanisms work, and also the type of remediation provided through that system. Chris, there's a question on product carbon footprint. So will this be one of the main topics for ASI development in the new revision? What will be tricky as a footprint standard already exists, and what is the added value?
Yeah, so the focus of the performance standard will be on entity level pathways. So it's about the entities 1.5 or below 2-degree abatement, as in the current standard, essentially an evolution of that. In terms of product carbon footprint, which is less a measure of an entity's emissions reduction performance, but is more about offering material to a customer that meets their requirements, that has been something that we've been asked to look at as part of claims. The claim for a product's carbon footprint at a given level. So while we're looking at product carbon footprint, it's not within the standard itself. It's one of the added benefits of ASI membership. It has interactions with the standard, potentially with chain of custody flow of material, but it's not forming part of the performance standard per se. It is going to be tricky. I'll tell you, even from the beginning right now, as we look at confidence in the data and uncertainty in numbers, the ability to make differentiating claims is going to be quite difficult. And as you may know, there are different approaches to allocation of emissions as well that are going to complicate matters. So to say that, yes, we'll be looking at product carbon footprinting, we will be looking at existing materials, and rather than redesigning those, looking at systems to verify those footprints. So you build on ASI's assurance processes to provide verification against individual claims, if that is possible. But it's not a given that we'll come out with product carbon footprint, verified product carbon footprints, because it's a tricky discussion.
And just to add to that, any of the kinds of categories of different claims that ASI is looking to explore with our members, those would be voluntary kind of optional elements in the ASI system. So they don't become part of the standard, they don't become mandatory. It's more if there's value, if members see value in making comparable verified claims, that then that methodology and the sort of supporting systems behind it would become available, but quite an important distinction.
There's a feedback loop there, which is to say that currently our emissions reduction criteria are essentially measured cradle to gate. So they take account of upstream scope 3 emissions. So as downstream entities build emissions reduction curves, they need standardized approach to the metal that they procure, which is indeed a carbon footprint of their supplier. So there is a feedback loop in some of this carbon footprint work to standardize the flow of information through the system. But as Chelsea said, yeah, the actual claims themselves are voluntary.
One follow-up on the question about audit teams. So Cam Jones, our Director of Assurance and Risk, who's on the call, also just pointed out that we will be putting on the table for discussion by the Standards Committee, sort of looking at the composition of audit teams to include more specific requirements around technical specialists, social auditors, et cetera. So Penny on our Standards Committee is also actually sitting on the Assurance Subcommittee. So those will be some of the topics that are going to be discussed as well over the next kind of 6 to 12 months. And maybe last question that we've got through in the interest of time is a question about can and how ASI support compliance with due diligence legislation that's popping up in various jurisdictions? So that's a really good question. And this was a main topic of discussion at the ICL standard setting meeting that happened in October of last year, where different voluntary standard systems from forestry, from agriculture, from mining and metals come together to talk about kind of different challenges and opportunities. I think we're looking at approaching this in two ways. First, the language in that question is really important. We are looking to support companies in better meeting some of this due diligence. We're not looking to be the vehicle that automatically, creates compliance with due diligence legislation. That responsibility will still sit with members and entities. We do have the opportunity to make sure that within the standard, our requirements are reflective and keeping pace with due diligence expectations, and that is then mirrored across the application of the certification of entities across the value chain. So because we have an approach where companies across the value chain are certified against the performance standard, if each of those companies has due diligence requirements built into their standard and certification, you do create continuity across the value chain. We also will be looking at areas, for example, in terms of strengthening information that needs to be shared, not only upstream, but also downstream with customers to pass on critical information right around origin or supply chain mapping or things like that. That will be one of the topics for discussion to make sure that actually when companies are looking to map their supply chains or looking for more information upstream, that we're facilitating the sharing of that information through the ASI standards to the degree possible. And secondly, outside of the standard, we have a lot of information within the ASI system and the beyond certification work, the work of the IPAF, Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum, on what some of those risk areas upstream look like, and also what some of the mitigation efforts look like. And we will be also thinking about ways that that information can be better shared with our members, so that once you know where your product is coming from, and you have a good sense of what the risks are, you also have access to information about how those risks are changing over time, how they're being mitigated, and where you as an entity could perhaps support those efforts better. And then there's a question, a related question about, is it possible to create a standard checklist of due diligence for the members? At the moment, it's not something that we've thought about. We can certainly take that suggestion into consideration. I think one challenge is that our members are subject to a wide variety of different expectations and regulation around due diligence at the moment. So it's going to be very hard to have a standardized set. Certainly, I think we could do a better job explaining how the new standards could support members around due diligence expectations and what that would look like. But definitely an area for members to get involved in shaping. I don't know, Penny, if you want to comment on any of those areas before we draw things to a close.
Cam has put in the comment about where you were talking about the auditors and the process for assurance, etc. There's been quite a few discussions already about that, and it's very much in front of mind for us with auditability of the standard, making things easy for the actual auditors, as well as the certifying entities to understand how to prepare and ensure that they're right to make the actual assurance activities easier, and considering, that we're not putting something in that will actually, make it really impossible for us to get auditors. So we had some discussions about, adding something extra in where we've already got really difficulty to get those type of auditors, and we don't want to add that. We want to use what is already actually out there. So I think it's being considered, and it was really front of mind for us in what we're actually doing, because there's a lot more ESG assurance happening in the world, and there is a shortage of auditors across the globe, but we want things to be consistent and auditable, and make sure that the auditors we get are actually good and help us have the credibility of our standard upheld. Yeah,
great point, Penny. Yeah, very, very good. It's a shared challenge across different standard schemes at the moment. Yep. All right. Well, with that, we will thank you very much for your attention. We're kind of at the starting gate, even though we've been working behind the scenes for a while, but it's going to be hopefully an interesting and transformative revision project with potential to make some important improvements, even to very kind of good standards already in the sector. So we welcome your creative input, your innovations and ideas, and we look forward to being in touch over the next year or two on this. Thanks very much, and don't hesitate. There's an email on our standards page. If you have any thoughts or input at any point, you can send us a line, and that comes straight to our standards team to take into account. So no need to wait for upcoming webinars. Thanks very much. Have a good rest of your day, good rest of your evening or morning.